This video is for Chapter 5 in MTB 1370 when we are converting times and temperatures. So we'll first look at converting time from international time to traditional time and vice versa. International time is also called military time or U.S. military time, and it's based on the 24-hour clock where every minute of the day has a different 4-digit sequence of values. So you won't have a 5 p.m. and a 5 a.m. in international time because they have a unique 4-digit sequence of values. So international time is designated at 0001 for 12:01 a.m., 1 minute after midnight, and 12:59 for 12:59 p.m., which is 1 minute before 1 p.m. in the afternoon. The times before 1 p.m. are very similar. The traditional times that have the a.m. and the p.m. and the colon in between the digits are very similar to the international time or U.S. military time for the times from midnight until 1 p.m. From 1 p.m. through midnight, the values are a little bit different because we have to add 1,200 hours to the traditional time to get to the international or U.S. military time. So 1 p.m., if we get rid of the colon and add 1,200 to that, we would get 1,300. So 1,300 hours is the same as 1 p.m. And midnight is designated a couple different ways. Either 2,400 is midnight, or you'll also see 4 zeros, 0000, as midnight. Now, as we said, for the hours between 1 p.m., which is 1300, and 12 a.m., which is midnight, we add 1200 to the traditional time to find the equivalent international time. If I had a time such as 4 p.m., you would add 1,200 to that to get the equivalent international time. So take 1,200 and add that, you get 1,600. What's very important in international time is that we do not put the colon in the middle, nor do we put AM or PM because that's not needed, because every time in the day has a distinct set of 4 digits. Now, one way to visualize the 24-hour clock is with a clock. And you'll notice on the outside, we have the times dealing with the afternoon. Over here it says it's in the afternoon on the outside. So 1300 is like 1 p.m., then 1400 is 2 p.m., 1500 is 3 p.m., and so on. And on the inside, we kind of like have the AM times, which we would put AM in traditional time, but with 24-hour clock international time, we don't need the AM or PM, and we shouldn't use it. So 1 AM in the morning is 0100, 2 AM is 0200, 0300 is 3 AM, and so on. So you notice it's very similar to traditional time, except you always have 4 digits with international time, even if the first one is 0. So this is one time where we can lead with a 0 in this class. So 1100 is 11 a.m. and then 1200 is noon, which is 12 p.m. And then we jump to the outside for the afternoon times. So 1300 again is 1 p.m., 1400 is 2 p.m., all the way up to 2200 is 10 p.m., 2300 is 11 p.m., and then we have midnight. Another way to see the similarities or differences between the traditional time and the 24-hour clock or international time is with this chart. It's basically indicating the same information we had in the clock, except in a chart or table format. So here are our traditional times on the left in AM, and then their equivalent times in international time, which again are very similar for the most part, except international time we never use AM or PM, and we never use a colon, and we have to have the 4 digits even if it does start with a 0. And then for afternoon we have our traditional times, which we would always have to put PM. With traditional time we always would have to put AM and PM after it, and then their associated international times in the last column. Now we're going to get some practice. We have, I believe, 10 different times there. The ones on the left are traditional times, and we're going to convert those to international times, and the ones on the right are international times, and we're going to convert them to traditional times. So if I have 3:15 p.m., since that's in the afternoon, after 1 p.m. you add 1200 to that. So if you add 1200, you would get 15:15 with no colon and no AM or PM. 4:45 a.m. would just be 0, 4, 4, 5. 5:30 p.m., since it's 1 p.m. or later, we add 1200 to it. You get 1730. 10:10 p.m. is after 1 p.m., so we add 1200 to it. 12:35 a.m. That's just 35 minutes after midnight, and we do not put 24:35. It's basically you start the day over again, so you start at the 4 zeros, so it'd be 0035. 35 minutes after midnight, 0035. So what we just wrote down, those are international times or U.S. military times, no colons, no AM or PM needed. If we had international time and we wanted to convert back to traditional time, it's just the reverse. So 0017 means 17 minutes after midnight, so that's 12:17 a.m. Very important that you put the colon in traditional time and the AM or the PM. 10:10, well, that's in the morning because it's under 1200 hours, so that would just be 10:10 a.m. 1730, well, we kind of just did this one, so 1730 you would subtract 1200. So if it's a value at 1300 or more, you subtract 1200 for it. If you subtract 1200, you get 530, and since it is over 1200, you put PM. Again, since it's greater than 1300, you subtract 1200, and if you subtract 1200 from that, you would get 11:10 at night, PM. 0635, that means that's in the morning, 6:35 a.m. So again, in some cases, we need to add 1200 if it's 1 p.m. or later. And in some cases, if we're converting back to traditional time, we need to subtract 1200. Now, when you were in high school, possibly in a chemistry class, you might have used conversion formulas that had fractions like 9/5 or 5/9 instead in these formulas. Well, we're going to simplify that and convert that 9/5 to its equivalent decimal. 9/5 is 1.8. So to convert from Fahrenheit to Celsius or Celsius to Fahrenheit, these are the two formulas that you'll be using. But in reality, you just need to know one of them. If you memorize this top formula, this formula converts Celsius into Fahrenheit. So you put degrees Celsius in for the C, you multiply it by 1.8 and add 32, and you'll get the equivalent degrees Fahrenheit. So again, where the C is, that's where you put your degrees Celsius. You multiply according to the order of operations. We have to multiply before we add. Now, if you're converting from Fahrenheit into Celsius, that means you're going to put a value in for Fahrenheit and you're going to solve for Celsius. Now, to solve for C, you would first subtract 32 from both sides and then lastly divide by the 1.8. And that's what would yield this formula here. So if you have some skills in algebra, just a little bit of skills in algebra, you don't need to memorize both of those formulas. You can memorize the top formula, and you'll have to know that for the test, and then you could solve to get the bottom formula. Again, so to memorize the top formula, and then if you know F and you want to know C, you can solve the top equation for C by subtracting 32 from both sides and then dividing by 1.8, and that will give you the bottom formula. Sometimes when you try to memorize too many things, you get them mixed up. So it might be best just to memorize the top one and be able to use it to solve for the bottom. Now in healthcare, we will use two different scales, the Celsius and the Fahrenheit scale, and we're most familiar with the Fahrenheit scale. And on the right, we have the Fahrenheit scale. Some important points about the Fahrenheit scale is that if you look at where water, pure water, freezes, it's 32 degrees. Well, in the Celsius scale, that is 0 degrees Celsius. Where pure water boils on the Fahrenheit scale is 212. That's 100 degrees on the Celsius scale. So one thing you should notice is that the values in the Fahrenheit scale are more spread out and shifted up a little bit, because 32 is higher than 0 and 212 is greater than 100. So there's more spread on the Fahrenheit scale, and there's a little bit shift upward. And that's where the multiplying by 1.8 comes into play, and the adding upward of 32 to shift it upward. So let's see if we can convert. So we want to convert 95 degrees Fahrenheit to Celsius. So going back to the formulas, the one you're going to memorize is Fahrenheit is equal to 1.8 times C plus 32. Well, in this problem, we know a temperature Fahrenheit. We don't know Celsius. So to solve that equation for Celsius, we're going to subtract 32 from both sides, and we'll get F minus 32 is equal to 1.8 times C, because when we subtract 32 on the right-hand side, that 32 becomes a 0 when we subtract 32 from it. And then to isolate the C, since it's 1.8 times C, we want to divide by 1.8. So that's where we get Celsius is equal to the degrees Fahrenheit minus 32 divided by 1.8. And then what we do is we put 95 in for F. And that's what we have here. We have 95 minus 32 divided by 1.8. We have to subtract first, and then we divide the answer by 1.8. So let's look at that, see if we can look at that on our calculator. One way you can use the TI-30XS to do this is using parentheses wisely. In the numerator, you can open the parenthesis and you go 95 minus 32, close the parenthesis. You want all of that, or the answer to that, divided by 1.8. So that's why we had to put that in parentheses and go divided by 1.8. And in one line, we see that the answer is 35. So you don't have to do it in multi-steps. You can do it in one step if you enter the parentheses correctly there. So 35 degrees Celsius is our answer. Now in the next problem, we are given degrees Celsius and we have to convert that to Fahrenheit. So again, we go back to the original formula. Fahrenheit is equal to 1.8 times degrees Celsius plus 32. That's the formula you have to have memorized. And since we know Celsius, we just put that in for C, like they did there. and then we multiply and add 32. Now, according to our order of operations, we have to multiply before we add 32 to it. So again, on the TI 30 XS multi-view, let me push clear. Let's do that. So I go 1.8 times 35. If you'd like to push enter, you could. Enter. You get 63. And then you have to add the 32 to it. Add 32. And you get 95 degrees Fahrenheit. 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, what we did is we had to multiply first and then add 32. And your calculator is pretty smart. You could have also just went 1.8 times 35 plus 32 in one step and got 95 as well. Your calculator knows the order of operations there to multiply before it adds. Now on the next slide we have a few problems to work out. If we have 40 degrees Fahrenheit, convert that to Celsius. 75 degrees Fahrenheit, convert that to Celsius. And then we have a couple Celsius temperatures to convert to Fahrenheit. So why don't you push pause on this video at this time and do those 4 problems, and then once you have those 4 problems done, push play again to check your work on the next 2 slides. Alright, welcome back. Now, those 4 problems that we were going to check your answers on, the first one was in degrees Fahrenheit, and you had to convert to Celsius. So remember what we had. Recall the formula. It was F is equal to 1.8 C plus 32. But in this problem we knew F, we wanted to know C, so to get C alone we said we had to subtract 32 from both sides and then divide by 1.8 to get C alone. So I skipped some steps there, but in a previous slide we showed it step by step. So that's what we have here. So we take our temperature Fahrenheit, 40, put it in for F, go minus 32 and divide it by 1.8, and we get 4.4 repeating, and that's in degrees Celsius. The next one, very similar. We were given a degrees Fahrenheit, so we're going to put that degrees Fahrenheit in for F, subtract 32, then divide by 1.8, and if we round it to 2 decimal places, we'll get 23.89 degrees Celsius. So hopefully you're checking your answer and you're getting the same results as these. And the last 2 problems probably are the easier problems. F is equal to 1.8 times C plus 32. And all we have to do is put these values in for C and times them by 1.8 and then add 32, and we get the equivalent degrees Fahrenheit out. Make sure we put the degree symbol and the F for Fahrenheit after your answers. So hopefully when you checked your answers, you got all 4 of those problems right, converting between Celsius and Fahrenheit scales.